The truck's headlights cut through the darkness at 2 in the morning, and Sarah froze in her kitchen doorway, her heart slamming against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. A stranger's boots crunched slow and deliberate on the gravel of her driveway. She was alone, completely alone, out on 60 acres with no neighbor close enough to hear her scream. Then she heard it, a sound she would never forget for the rest of her life. A deep, guttural bray, raw and furious, tearing through the night like a blade through canvas. It wasn't the sound of an animal anymore. It was the sound of a promise being kept. And within seconds, 40-year-old Sarah Whitfield watched something happen in her front yard that she still can't fully explain, something that would change forever the way an entire town looked at an animal everyone once laughed at. Have you ever had a moment where an animal you doubted turned out to be the very thing that saved your life? Think about that question honestly for a second, because it matters more than you might realize. Think about the creature in your own life that people overlooked, the one that seemed unremarkable, maybe even a little useless to everyone watching from the outside. And now imagine what it would feel like to discover that very animal was your protector all along, waiting quietly for the one night it mattered most. That is the question Sarah has asked herself every single day since, and it is the question this story is about to ask you too. Because 3 years before that truck ever rolled up her driveway with its headlights off, Sarah Whitfield made a decision that had half the town shaking their heads and laughing behind cupped hands. She bought a donkey. Not a guard dog with sharp teeth and a trained bark. Not a security system with cameras wired to her phone. A donkey. A gray, long-eared, stubborn animal named Gus, purchased for $400 at a livestock auction 2 counties over, hauled home in the back of a borrowed trailer on a cold October afternoon while the wind bit at her cheeks and the sky hung low and gray above the fields. Her neighbor, Roy Callahan, a big, broad-shouldered man who had farmed the land beside hers for 30 years, stood at her fence line that same afternoon with his arms crossed and a grin stretched wide across his weathered face. "A donkey, Sarah? You bought yourself a donkey to guard your sheep?" He laughed so hard he had to steady himself against a fence post, wiping at his eyes. "Donkeys aren't dogs, honey. That animal is going to eat your grass, kick your fence, and do absolutely nothing else. You want real protection out here, you get a good cattle dog. Or better yet, you get yourself a shotgun and learn to use it." Sarah had only smiled that day, the quiet smile of a woman who had already made up her mind and didn't need anybody's blessing to feel sure of it. She had read about guardian donkeys before making the purchase, how their natural hatred of predators like coyotes and stray dogs made them fierce protectors of a flock, how their aggressive stomping and their deafening bray could send something twice their size running for cover. But if she was honest with herself, lying awake that first night listening to Gus shuffle and settle in the barn, she hadn't bought him purely out of research and logic. She had bought him because something in his eyes at that auction had reached straight into her chest and squeezed. While every other animal in that crowded, chaotic pen had been kicking and braying and straining against the gate, Gus had stood perfectly still in the corner, watching everything unfold around him with a calm, steady patience that made him look less like livestock and more like a soldier waiting for orders. Sarah's life, in the months leading up to that auction, had folded itself into a quiet and careful kind of loneliness that nobody who hadn't lived it could fully understand. Her husband Daniel had died of a sudden heart attack while repairing their barn roof on an ordinary Tuesday morning in April, the kind of morning that started with coffee and birdsong and ended in an ambulance ride that changed everything. 22 years of shared decisions, shared worries, shared late-night conversations about lambing season and mortgage payments and whether the old tractor would make it through one more winter. And then, in the space of a single terrible afternoon, all of that became hers to carry alone. Their small flock of 12 ewes had been Daniel's pride and joy, something he had built slowly over a decade of patient breeding and careful selection, and Sarah could not bring herself to sell them after he was gone. Keeping the sheep felt like keeping a piece of him alive, walking the same fence lines he had walked, filling the same water troughs he had filled. But keeping them safe out there, alone, with coyotes calling from the tree-covered hills at night, and her nearest help, a phone call and 10 long minutes away, that had become a weight she carried every single evening when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long and unfamiliar across her land. She never told anyone how frightened she really was during those first lonely months. Not her sister in Ohio, who called faithfully every Sunday evening and always asked if she was eating enough, sleeping enough, doing enough to take care of herself. Not Roy next door, who checked on her more often than she wanted him to, and always found some excuse to linger by her gate a few extra minutes. She simply lay awake most nights listening to every creak and groan the old farmhouse made, wondering if tonight would be the night something finally happened out there in the dark, with no one close enough to hear her call for help. That is the loneliness Gus walked into on that cold October afternoon. And it is a loneliness so many people watching this story right now understand far more deeply than they would ever say out loud to another living soul. The first few weeks with Gus were nothing at all like Sarah had expected. He was every bit as stubborn as everyone warned her he would be, refusing some mornings to move even 1 inch from a patch of sweet clover, no matter how hard she pulled on his lead rope, planting all 4 hooves into the dirt like he had grown roots there overnight. He had a habit of staring at her with those enormous liquid brown eyes whenever she brought his feed bucket out to the barn, like he was quietly studying her, deciding something important about her character that he wasn't ready to share. Roy would drive by some mornings and holler out his truck window with a grin. "That donkey done anything useful for you yet, Sarah?" And she would simply wave back and keep walking, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an answer, because the honest truth was, she didn't have one yet either. But slowly, so slowly that she almost didn't notice the change happening beneath her own feet, something began to shift between them. It started with small things, the kind of things you only notice in hindsight, looking back with new eyes. Gus began positioning himself every single evening at the edge of the pasture nearest the tree line, right where the dark woods pressed in close, as if he had quietly appointed himself sentry over the exact spot where danger was most likely to come creeping from. When a red-tailed hawk swooped low over the newborn lambs one blustery spring afternoon, Gus let out a bray so loud and violent that it sent the startled bird veering sharply off course, and every single ewe in that field scattered instinctively toward him instead of away, clustering tight around his legs the way frightened children cluster around a parent, trusting him without question to keep them safe. Sarah started talking to him the way lonely people talk to animals when there is no one else left around to listen to their thoughts. She would tell him about her day while she filled his water trough in the early mornings, the mist still clinging low to the fields. She would tell him about Daniel sometimes too, about the way he used to whistle off key while he worked on the fences, about how much she missed the simple sound of another person moving through the rooms of her house. Gus would stand there patiently, ears swiveling toward the sound of her voice, chewing slowly on his hay, and something about his stillness felt exactly like being listened to. On the coldest nights that first winter, she would catch herself walking out to the barn for no real reason at all, just to stand near him for a few quiet minutes before bed, resting her palm against the warm curve of his neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her hand. And for those few stolen minutes, the house waiting behind her didn't feel quite so hollow and empty. By the time a full year had passed, Gus was no longer simply a fixture on the property. He had become, in every single way that truly mattered, Sarah's closest companion, the one steady presence she could count on through every kind of weather her grief threw at her. She caught herself laughing at his little antics, the way he would nudge her shoulder hard, demanding attention when he felt he wasn't getting enough of it, the way his ears would prick forward the instant her truck came rumbling up the driveway, unmistakably glad to see her return. The neighbors who used to snicker whenever the topic of her donkey came up started going quiet because they had all begun noticing the exact same thing Sarah had noticed for months now. Not one single coyote had come near that flock in over a year. Not one lamb had gone missing from her fields, not even during the harshest stretch of that brutal winter in a county where predator loss was simply an accepted, unavoidable cost of raising sheep. People began to quietly wonder, though few would say it out loud to Roy's face, whether there was something real to that stubborn gray animal after all. Then came the spring when everything Sarah thought she understood about safety got torn apart in the space of a single terrifying week, a week that started so small she almost didn't notice the warning signs stacking up around her until it was nearly too late. It began with something Sarah almost dismissed entirely. She noticed the gate to her equipment shed standing open one gray morning, though she was certain, absolutely certain, that she had latched it tight the evening before. A few days later, she found unfamiliar footprints pressed into the soft mud near the edge of her property line, boots that matched none of her own, none of her occasional hired hands either. She mentioned it to Roy over the fence, and he shrugged it off easily. Told her it was probably just some hunter cutting through on his way to the state land, nothing worth losing sleep over. But Sarah couldn't shake the prickling feeling crawling up the back of her neck every time she walked out to the barn after dark that week, that unmistakable sensation of being watched from somewhere deep in the tree line where the shadows pooled thick. Then one evening, returning home from a routine doctor's appointment in town, she found her mail scattered across the porch, envelopes torn open and left in the wind, several pieces missing entirely, including, she realized with a sinking, cold feeling in her stomach, a bank statement with her account number printed right there on the page. She called the sheriff's department that same night, and a young deputy came out an hour later, took a careful report, told her these things happened sometimes in rural areas, that drifters passed through occasionally, and that it was probably nothing serious to worry over, though he did advise her to keep her door. She started sleeping with an old baseball bat propped against her nightstand. She started checking every window in the house twice before switching off the lights each night. And every single evening, without exception, right around midnight, Gus began braying at the tree line, a low, agitated, unfamiliar sound Sarah had genuinely never heard him make before, not even during the fiercest thunderstorms that had rattled her windows the previous summer. She would climb out of bed and go to the window and find him standing rigid and alert in the pale moonlight, staring hard into the darkness of the woods, ears pinned flat against his skull, and something about the sheer intensity of his stance sent a shiver crawling down her spine every single time she watched it. Roy told her, gently but firmly, that she was working herself into a needless state over nothing at all. Her sister on the phone suggested, more than once, that maybe it was finally time to think seriously about selling the property and moving into town, somewhere with close neighbors and streetlights on every corner. Sarah found herself defending her decision to stay with less and less real conviction each time the subject came up, because the honest truth, the truth she barely admitted to herself in the dark, was that some nights, alone in that farmhouse with every ordinary sound magnified tenfold by fear, she genuinely did not know if she had the strength left in her to keep doing this by herself. The lowest point of that entire terrible stretch came on a quiet Thursday evening in late April, almost exactly 2 years since the month Daniel had died. Sarah had spent the whole day up to her elbows in the exhausting, heartbreaking work of trying to save a sick newborn lamb, a fight she ultimately lost just before sundown, and by the time night fell she was worn down to nothing, hollowed out by a kind of exhaustion that went bone deep, grief stacked directly on top of older grief. She sat down hard on her back porch steps after burying that small lamb behind the barn, and she cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in months, not delicate, quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and long neglected inside her chest. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said out loud to the empty yard, to the darkening sky above her, to nobody at all who could possibly answer. "I don't know if I have it in me anymore, Daniel. I really don't think I do." And that is when she felt something warm and solid press gently against her shoulder. Gus had wandered up from the pasture on his own, pushed his big gray head over the low porch railing, and simply leaned into her, his warm breath stirring against her wet cheek, standing there in complete silence while she cried into the coarse fur of his neck the way she used to cry into her husband's chest after a hard day. He did not move away. He did not grow restless or pull back. He simply stood there in the darkness, patient and unwavering, letting a broken, exhausted woman hold on to him for as long as she needed to, and something about that steadiness reached a part of Sarah that nothing else in 2 long years had managed to touch. That night, for the first time since Daniel's funeral, Sarah did not feel entirely alone in the world. But the fear did not disappear, and neither did the strange, unsettling signs that someone had been watching her property, studying her routines, learning exactly when a woman living alone on 60 isolated acres would be most vulnerable to whatever they were planning. Looking back on it now, Sarah understands that whoever it was had been circling closer for weeks, testing the boundaries, waiting patiently for the right moment. She simply didn't know it yet. Not fully, not in a way that could have prepared her for what came next. And nothing. Not the sheriff's calm reassurances, not Roy's dismissive shrugs, not her own repeated attempts to convince herself she was simply overreacting to shadows, could have readied her for the night. Everything finally came to a head. It happened on a Tuesday, the 2nd week of May, a night Sarah remembers now with a clarity so sharp it still makes her hands tremble whenever she tells the story. She had gone to bed around 11 after a long, aching day of fence repair, her whole body sore, sleep pulling at her before her head had even fully settled onto the pillow. She woke sometime after 1 in the morning to the sound of gravel crunching slowly beneath tires, deliberate and quiet, the kind of sound a vehicle makes when someone is trying very hard not to be heard approaching. Her heart lurched violently into her throat. She lay perfectly still in the darkness, straining every nerve to listen, silently praying it was Roy, checking on a downed fence line, or a lost traveler simply turning around in her long driveway. But the engine did not turn around. It slowed. It stopped. And then the night went completely, unbearably quiet. Sarah eased herself out of bed and crept toward her bedroom window with the careful, silent precision of pure animal terror, and what she saw through the glass stopped her heart cold in her chest. A dark pickup truck, headlights switched off entirely, parked near the edge of her driveway close to the equipment shed. A man's shadowed silhouette climbing out from the driver's side, moving toward her house with slow, unhurried, deliberate steps, something long and metal gripped in his hand that caught a faint glint of moonlight, something that might have been a crowbar, or might have been something far worse. She grabbed her phone off the nightstand with shaking hands and dialed 911, whispering her address into the phone in a voice she barely recognized as her own, the dispatcher on the other end telling her calmly to stay on the line, stay low, stay quiet, that help was already on the way, 11 minutes out. 11 minutes. Alone in a farmhouse with a stranger closing the distance toward her front door in the dead of night, 11 minutes stretched out ahead of her like 11 separate lifetimes. She wasn't sure she would survive. Sarah crouched low beneath her bedroom window, phone pressed hard against her ear, listening to footsteps crunch steadily closer across her front yard, her entire body shaking so violently she could barely keep the phone from slipping from her grip. And in that single unbearable moment, every ounce of the calm, capable woman she had spent 2 hard years building herself into simply dissolved into something smaller and then she heard it. A sound unlike anything she had ever heard Gus make before, not the low, agitated bray he had used at the tree line all those recent weeks, but something wilder, more furious, more ancient, a sound that seemed to rise up from somewhere primal deep inside him, part warning and part outright attack, a cry that split the stillness of the night wide open. Through her window, in the pale silver wash of moonlight, Sarah watched Gus come tearing out of the dark pasture like something unleashed from a locked cage, ears flattened, teeth bared, hooves tearing great clumps out of the wet earth as he charged straight at the stranger moving toward her front porch. The man froze mid-step, clearly caught off guard by 400 pounds of enraged donkey barreling out of the darkness toward him, and he stumbled backward just as Gus reached him, rearing high onto his hind legs with a scream that Sarah felt vibrate through her own chest, even through the closed glass of her window. The stranger swung wildly with whatever was gripped in his hand, catching Gus hard across the shoulder, and for one horrifying, breath-stealing second, Sarah was certain her donkey had gone down. But Gus did not fall. He did not so much as flinch. He came down hard, front hooves striking the earth mere inches from the man's boots, and reared again immediately, driving forward relentlessly, forcing the intruder to stumble backward step after frantic step across the yard, away from the porch, away from the door, away from Sarah. The man cursed loudly, scrambling backward now, clearly rattled and terrified by an animal that simply refused to stop coming, refused to yield a single inch of ground, positioning his own body squarely between the stranger and the farmhouse, like he understood with perfect, unwavering clarity exactly what he was protecting, and exactly what it might cost him not to. Sarah watched from her window, tears streaming freely down her face now, whispering broken pleas into a phone the dispatcher could barely make out over her own ragged, panicked breathing, as her donkey, the same animal her neighbor. The intruder finally broke and turned, sprinting hard for his truck, and Gus chased him the entire distance, snapping and striking the air behind his heels, refusing to end the pursuit even as the man wrenched the truck door open. Even then, Gus did not back down. He planted himself directly behind the vehicle, blocking its only exit, refusing to move an inch, forcing the man to swerve wildly across the yard, tearing straight through Sarah's flower bed and clipping a fence post hard enough to splinter it, before finally veering onto the gravel driveway and speeding away into the darkness, red taillights disappearing fast over the distant hill. And Gus did not move from that exact spot. Not when the taillights finally vanished from sight, not for nearly 10 full minutes afterward, standing rigid and alert in the silver moonlight, watching the empty driveway with fierce concentration, ears still pricked hard toward the direction the truck had fled, as if daring it to try coming back. Sarah stood frozen at her window with both trembling hands pressed flat against the glass, sobbing openly now, watching the animal who had just risked everything for her stand guard over her home like a sentinel carved from solid stone. When the sheriff's deputies finally arrived 8 long minutes later, red and blue lights washing across the front yard, they found Sarah still shaking on her porch steps and Gus standing close beside her, his shoulder brushing protectively against her arm, still breathing hard from the fight, a shallow, bleeding gash carved along his shoulder where the crowbar had struck him. The deputies took her full statement, searched the property thoroughly, and found tire tracks along with a partial boot print they would later use to identify a man with a string of similar break-in attempts spread across 3 separate counties, a man who was thankfully arrested 2 weeks later after trying the exact same thing at a farmhouse 40 miles east, except that homeowner had no donkey standing guard, and the outcome there was, tragically, far more violent than Sarah's had ever come close to being. One of the deputies, a young man named Marcus who had grown up on a ranch himself, knelt down beside Gus and examined the cut on his shoulder. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think that donkey right there very likely saved your life tonight. I mean that seriously." A man showing up alone at night with a weapon, targeting a woman living by herself in an isolated house. That kind of situation goes bad more often than most people would ever want to know. He never got the chance to find out what that man had planned for you because your donkey simply refused to give him the chance. Sarah couldn't find any words at all. She simply sank down into the wet grass beside Gus, wrapped both arms tight around his thick neck, and cried harder than she had at any point in the 2 years since Daniel's death. Great heaving sobs of pure terror and overwhelming relief and gratitude, so enormous it felt like her whole chest might crack wide open beneath the weight of it. Gus stood perfectly still and let her hold him, exactly the way he always did, his rapid breathing slowly settling back to normal, his body warm and solid and undeniably wonderfully real beneath her shaking hands, proof beyond any doubt that he was still. The days that followed passed by in a strange, hazy blur that Sarah still struggles to fully piece together in order. A local veterinarian drove out to clean and carefully stitch the wound on Gus's shoulder, assuring her repeatedly that it would heal cleanly with proper daily care, and Sarah spent the following 2 weeks changing that bandage every single morning with hands that still trembled every time she thought about how close that crowbar had actually come to striking his skull instead of his shoulder. She barely slept those first few nights afterward, jumping awake at every small sound, replaying the entire terrifying sequence over and over in her mind, the truck, the footsteps, the 11 endless minutes. But every single time the fear crept back in and threatened to swallow her whole, she would look out her bedroom window and see Gus standing steady in the pasture below, alive, slowly healing, still watching over the property exactly the way he always had, and something tight in her chest would loosen just enough to let her finally breathe again. Word travels fast in a small town, the way it always inevitably does. Within a single week, half the county had heard some version of the story, the widow, the intruder, the donkey nobody had ever truly believed in. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from people she barely knew, wanting to hear the details straight from her own mouth, wanting to know if it was really true that a donkey had chased off an armed man in the middle of the night. A reporter from the regional newspaper drove all the way out and took photographs of Gus standing calmly in the pasture, his stitched shoulder catching the soft afternoon light. And the resulting article ran under a headline that brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes the first time she read it in print at her kitchen table. Roy Callahan showed up at her fence line 4 days after it all happened, and Sarah braced herself instinctively, half expecting another round of gentle teasing, though something in the set of his face told her this particular visit would be different from all the others. He stood there for a long, quiet moment, working his jaw, staring hard at Gus grazing peacefully a few yards away in the sunlight, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out far quieter than Sarah had ever once heard from him in all their years as neighbors. "I owe that animal a real apology," he said slowly, "and I reckon I owe you one too, for every single time I made you feel foolish about trusting your own gut on this." He reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a 50-pound bag of the good grain, the expensive kind Sarah never let herself splurge on, and set it down carefully just inside her gate without saying another word before climbing back into his truck and driving off down the road. Sarah stood there holding back fresh tears, watching him go, understanding all at once that some apologies simply don't need very many words at all to mean everything. But it wasn't the newspaper article, or Roy's unexpected bag of grain, or the endless stream of calls from curious neighbors that changed something fundamental in Sarah over the weeks that followed. It was something far quieter than that, something that shifted deep inside her. A change she felt fresh every single morning when she walked out to the pasture, and Gus lifted his big gray head to greet her, ears pricked forward, eyes bright and clear, seemingly unaware, or perhaps simply unbothered, that what he had done that night had been nothing short of extraordinary. To him, it seemed, protecting her hadn't been some grand act of heroism at all. It had simply been what he was there to do, plain and simple. And there was something so quietly profound about that realization to Sarah, the understanding that this animal's loyalty had never been performed for anyone's benefit or approval, had never sought out praise or reward of any kind. It simply existed, steady and unwavering, exactly the same on the single worst night of her entire life as it had been on every quiet, unremarkable morning that came both before and after it. She thought often, in the long weeks that followed, about what her life might look like now if she had simply listened to everyone who told her a donkey was a foolish, impractical choice from the very beginning. If she had bought a dog instead, or nothing at all, or given up on the farm entirely and moved into town the way her sister kept gently suggesting over the phone. She thought about how close that 11-minute wait for the sheriff's deputies had come to being the only thing standing between her and a man with a weapon and clearly bad intentions, and how, in the end, it hadn't been the police who truly saved her that night at all. It had been the animal everyone in town had laughed at without a second thought. The stubborn gray creature with the oversized ears and the reputation for being little more than a glorified pasture ornament. He was the one who ran directly toward danger instead of away from it, who placed his own body between Sarah and a man twice his size wielding a weapon, who never once stopped, never hesitated, never paused to calculate the personal cost to himself before deciding to act. Sarah understands now, in a way she genuinely did not understand fully before that terrifying night, that loyalty like that cannot simply be trained into an animal or forced through obedience and repetition alone. It is something that grows slowly and quietly, through years of small, unremarkable moments that nobody else is ever watching. The late-night conversations murmured over a water trough, the silent company offered on cold porch steps during the loneliest winter nights, the trust built patiently, one ordinary day at a time, until eventually it hardens into something entirely unbreakable. Gus did not save her life that night simply because he had been trained from birth to guard a flock of sheep. He saved her life because somewhere along the long, quiet way, in all those small, unremarkable days that came before, she had become his to protect, fully and completely, and protecting her had come to matter more to him than his own safety ever could. It has been almost a full year now since that terrible night, and Sarah still lives on the very same 60 acres, still tends the same small flock her late husband first started building all those years ago, and Gus still takes up his post at the edge of the tree line every single evening as the sun begins to sink, an old habit that Sarah now understands. His shoulder healed cleanly into a small patch of scar tissue hidden beneath his thick gray coat, a quiet mark. Sarah still runs her fingers over sometimes during the early morning feedings, a small physical reminder of everything he willingly gave for her without ever once being asked to give it. She sleeps easier now, not because the fear from that night has faded away entirely, because some nights it still creeps quietly back in, and it probably always will to some degree, but because she knows now, in the deepest and most certain part of herself, that she is not nearly as alone out there as she once genuinely believed. Not with him standing watch over her, People ask her sometimes, when the story naturally comes up after church or over the counter at the local feed store in town, whether she has ever thought about getting a proper guard dog to work alongside Gus now for a little extra protection and a little extra peace of mind. Sarah always smiles the same small, knowing smile and gently shakes her head. "I have got all the protection I could ever need," she tells them every single time. He has just got 4 legs and a pair of long ears instead of fur and fangs, but he would do it all again in a heartbeat without a single moment's hesitation. I know that for certain now. I watched him do it with my own 2 eyes, and maybe that is the real lesson quietly buried at the heart of this entire story, the one that matters even more than the raw drama of that terrifying night itself, more than the newspaper headline, more than Roy's heartfelt apology, more even than the small physical scar still visible on Gus's shoulder. It is simply this: the ones who love us most in this life rarely ever announce it out loud. They don't need applause, and they don't need recognition. They simply show up, day after ordinary day, standing quietly at the edge of the tree line, watching, waiting, always ready, and when the moment finally arrives that truly tests what all that quiet loyalty is really worth, they do not hesitate for even a single second. They run straight toward the danger, because somewhere along the way, without any fanfare at all, we became theirs to protect, just as fully and completely as they had already become ours to love. So here is what I genuinely want to ask you, from one animal lover to another. If you have a creature in your own life right now, a dog curled up faithfully at your feet, a horse waiting patiently in your barn, even a stubborn old cat who pretends not to care one bit about you, have you ever really stopped and truly considered what they would do for you if the very worst night of your life came knocking unexpectedly at your door? And has an animal in your own life ever surprised you, shown you a kind of loyalty or quiet courage you never once expected from them, the exact way Gus surprised an entire skeptical town that once thought a donkey was nothing more than a walking joke? I would truly love for you to share your own story down in the comments below this video. Tell all of us about the animal that showed up for you exactly when you needed it most, the one nobody else around you seemed to believe in until the very day it finally mattered. These kinds of stories deserve to be told out loud, and I promise you, someone reading your words tonight, somewhere out there, genuinely needs to hear them. And if stories exactly like this one, stories about the unbreakable bond between us and the animals who love us so completely and without any condition at all, if these kinds of stories touch something deep inside your heart, the same way they continue to touch mine, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we bring you a brand new story just like this one, a story that will remind you all over again why these bonds matter so very much. Give this video a like if Gus earned your full respect today. Drop your honest answers to those 2 questions down in the comments section below, and thank you so much for watching this story all the way through, and we will see you again very soon in the next one.